Monica Worline is the founder and CEO of Enliven Work, and it's an innovation organization that teaches businesses and others how to tap into their courageous thinking, their compassionate leadership, and the curiosity to bring their best life at work, which is one of the most important things to me. She is a research scientist at Stanford University's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, and the executive director of the Compassion Lab, the world's leading research collaboratory focused on compassion at work. Monica holds a lectureship at Ross School of Business, and she is the director of the Center for Positive Organizations. Jane Dutton is the Robert L. Kahn Distinguished University Professor of Business Administration and Psychology at the Ross School of Business. She is a co-founder of the Center for Positive Organizations and is passionate about cultivating human flourishing at work. Her research focuses on compassion, job crafting, high quality connections, and meaning making at work. She has written more than 100 articles and published 13 books. I think I've probably read almost every one of them. And she is a founding member of the Compassion Lab. And you can visit the Compassion Lab at www.compassionlab.org. Oh, and here comes some more folks. Now, I saw in the book, I read through the book a little bit again this week, and I saw that the statistic, which just really popped out at me, that we work up to $100,000 hours at our jobs during our lifetimes. And that just blew me away.
That's an average, and many of us work a lot more than that.
Yes.
So we spend a lot of hours of our life in workplaces, work organizations, and it's one of the reasons why it's so important to think about compassion in those spaces.
Yeah, I'll just add that what's interesting is as Monica and I got into studying compassion, again, most of it is thought about more at the individual or the dyadic level, but not thinking about workplaces as context. So given that statistic and given the fact that we're organizational researchers, it felt like a great match. So we've spent maybe now 20 years studying compassion in work organizations.
So we're going to talk about it today at both a interpersonal and organizational level. And I put a link in the chat for resources from today, but if you're watching this webinar and you're not in the chat live with us right now, you can follow that QR code that's showing on the screen. You can get the resources that we mentioned today, including a little guided blueprint that you can use to think about compassion in your own work organizations. And for those of you that are here live with us, welcome. We're going to pause and ask you to reflect with us. We invite you to use the chat panel. Jane and I engage in a practice that we like to call duetting. So we don't plan who's going to speak when and share the slides in a prearranged way. We like it to be an organic discussion, and we want it to unfold in response to what you are interested in. So please feel free to share and participate with us. Here are a couple of things we hope to do with you. We want to appreciate the benefits of compassion and talk about why it matters so much for human flourishing at work and for the kinds of things that organizations can do to meet the pressing problems that we have in our society right now. We'll talk about a few of the challenges that typically arise to compassion at work and some of the common ways we might think about mitigating those obstacles, as well as what research tells us about what amplifies and facilitates compassion. And we hope that you'll be thinking about organizations, teams, groups, projects, and other communities that matter to you, so that you can develop strategies that sit within those contexts and that really help bring compassion to life or awaken compassion in your work organizations. And depending on how far we get today, we might get through 4 topics. We might pause someplace and spend more time in one than another, which is all fine. But we're going to talk a little bit about why focus on compassion now. And we'll show you the way that we define compassion as an interpersonal and social process that really hinges on being able to notice suffering. So we're going to linger with noticing suffering and talk about how we can do more of that as a way to awaken the entire compassion process. And given how depleted and overwhelmed, exhausted, maybe socially worn out we are in this season, we will talk a little bit about how we think about compassion when we're coming from that kind of state, and how we can turn the same process that we're talking about as a social process into a set of questions that we can explore for ourselves in context too. So let's check in. If you're with us and you can grab your chat panel, we would love to know how you're arriving here and what's on your mind. And as we let people have a minute to try to find their chat and do that today, Jane, how are you arriving and what's on your mind?
I was just putting down here, I'm eager to share and eager to learn. The way that I got to studying compassion in organizations had to do with, at the U of M, I was in 2 departments, the psych department and the business school. So we had major suffering that hit our family. This was about 25 years ago. It's all fine. But the one department responded much more compassionately than another. There were good people in both. And so it was this giant puzzle about what is it about an organizational context that makes a difference. So I just wanted to give a little personal story about why what the puzzle that sort of animated me over the last 20 years to stay focused.
Thank you for reminding us of that story, Jane, or sharing for people that haven't heard us share that story in the past, or vivifying it, because it is the case that we started thinking about compassion with these examples of how organizations made such a difference in whether or not people felt that they could show up with compassion, but also structurally, whether or not the organization in a more scalable and reliable way could respond to suffering. And when Jane and I have studied compassion and speak with others who do the work of compassion research and compassion teaching, our niche in that world is really thinking about the structural elements of organizations and how they come together with the things that people need to do to be compassionate. And so we have, if you're watching the webinar, I hope you've paused and checked in with yourself about how you're arriving as you watch the video. We have some enthusiasm in the chat, Jane. We have people honoring the timelessness of this topic, but also that it feels pretty challenging right now. So we want to honor that. And before we move into the next point, I just want to share that what we're doing with this check-in is both a check-in with the people who have joined us today, because it helps us meet what's in the room, but it's also a compassion move that you can pick up and use in other web-based conferences. So you can using something like a check-in with a broad question about how people are showing up or what's coming into the room with them today. It's a way of giving a broad invitation for people to share both positive things like excitement and interest and enthusiasm, or this feels challenging. Things are a bit hard right now. Kim's a little bit under the weather, right? So we already saw little glimmers of suffering starting to show up in our chat. And it's one of the reasons we start with the question like this, because it makes room for us to notice what's coming in the room with people.
I'm
Monica,
blaming it on my flu shot.
oh,
Yeah, Jane, go ahead.
Monica, I just wanted to add that yesterday we were in a seminar with a bunch of practitioners and one of the CEOs that was there mentioned that he runs all of his meetings and he breaks them into thirds. And the first third is all about this check-in, where people are honestly saying, here is how I am today. And it sets the stage for not necessarily in that meeting, but for what unfolds later for people to, share concern and care in various ways. So I'm just saying it again, like this is partly about thinking about what can we do ourselves individually, but how can we build it into practices of faculty meetings or practices that are, again, in part of your world. How do we build it into our classrooms?
Oh, I love that so much.
Shared practices. Yeah, no, there's so much we can do.
Think about the way we run our one-on-ones in business.
This summer we had a committee meeting and it was virtual and we hadn't seen each other in a while. And literally the first half of the meeting was a check-in and our dean was on and I was like, oh my gosh, we got to get down to business, right? And I was getting kind of stressed. But I think because we took that time to check in, once we got to the business at hand, I mean, it was all done in like 15 minutes, right? People were warmed up and they were ready to go, and I just, it was just such a reminder to me.
So we talked about compassion and suffering. We've used some words that we're going to define a little bit more. But I think it's also, like Jane said, it's important just to refocus ourselves on why compassion matters and why it matters so much in organizations. And so one reason that compassion really needs to be on our minds right now is that we live in a society that's acting as if this major upheaval to life and major social trauma that happened during the pandemic is over and behind us and everyone has moved on. But in all kinds of ways, the world is still coming to grips with that time period. It's still changing and evolving. And we see all kinds of social upheavals going on around us that we can act as if aren't there, but we don't want to do that. So one way we might think about challenging times is that when we ignore suffering and act as if it's not relevant, it will continue to undermine our capacity, right, and to disturb our social organizations. So we want to be present to what is, which is a lot of suffering in the political environment. We have a lot of division. There's a lot of uncertainty about what might happen, a sense of dread about the future among some people. There's a lot of social inequality and financial distress in our society. And so there's just a lot of reasons that the social conditions set us up to be fearful and to come from a place of fear when we come into organizations of all kinds. And then there's the conditions of work, which many people find overwhelming, that there's a pressure to be always on, that as we grow more technologically sophisticated, we put more and more and more demands on people. And there's all kinds of ways that organizations give rise to overwhelm. And so there are so many reasons why compassion matters right now. We have so many pressing problems, and I'm going to pass the baton to Jane with this issue, right? Like from the perspective of the grandmother, right? Like, why do we care so much about trying to build more compassionate structures into our society?
Yes, what Monica is referring to is, having been a business school faculty member for 40 years, we can give you the business case for this, but I'm now a grandmother and I'm very fearful for my grandchildren. They're still young. And I feel like we can't solve the problems that we're facing with more money and more material resources. We have to understand how can we unleash human capacity and capability in the institutions that we have. And care and compassion, if an organization or if our family or whatever social group we're part of is more compassionate, then you can think of it as a healing force that that unleashes human capacity and capabilities to deal with these, huge pressing issues that we have facing us as a society. And I just have to say, because I imagine that many of the people on the call or the people that will listen to the recording are in education in some way, either as students or as faculty. And the disruption we're facing in education, along with the suffering, the acute suffering of a lot of students, but also staff and faculty, means, again, in a world where education is feeling so many pressures to do more with less and to send out students that are going to solve the world's problems. I feel like compassion as a healing force is particularly important.
And this is one of our favorite quotes. It comes from sociologist Robert Wuthnow, and it speaks to us of what Jane was saying, the message that compassion is a part of what enriches us beyond money and ennobles us in a way that helps us meet the needs that are present in our society, even if we're not actively caregivers or recipients of compassion, because it gives us a view of what a good society can be, and provides us with concrete examples of care that we can emulate. So we are curious to know, with this call of why compassion matters now, for the people who are here with us, and if you're watching this video, it's a good moment to pause and just ask yourself a reflective question. Where do you see the need for compassion in your work? What's coming up where surface suffering and is coming to the surface, and the need to address that suffering is becoming critical in your work organization? Jane, you already named in education, but do you see need for compassion being present now in your work, coming up in different ways?
Yeah, I was just going to write down about Thanksgiving tables and like what it means for families to come together, and you're all supposed to have, if you celebrate Thanksgiving or holidays around Christmas, everyone's supposed to be merry and cheery. And again, people are weighted down. And so I see a need for compassion and empathy and, safety, psychological safety for people to come together to enjoy these upcoming holidays. That would just be one example. I also have to say, because Monica knows I'm totally into generative AI right now, and I keep reading all these articles about the fear of, it displacing so many jobs, including academic jobs, and other jobs that, involve the heavy use of this tool. So I think that's an area where we need more compassion to both listen to the suffering and come up with ways to work with people to deal with it.
I think DEI is undergoing a bit of a transition right now. I think the need is still prevalent. We might call it by different things, but I think the basis of DEI is when you said psychological safety, it's just, you know, that and compassion it has to be the base of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because if people don't feel safe, how can you take those next steps into that?
And Mary is bringing forward in the chat the fear of the unknown, and all the kinds of fears that are coming, like social fears, financial fear, fear of layoffs, fear of social change, government change. I think there is a lot of fear in the air right now for some people, and that fear can create all kinds of distress that we can overlook in our work organizations if we aren't watching out for how it might affect the way people feel prepared to be at work. And Kim, like you said, what is it okay to share and not share? How do we talk about building more inclusive organizations? And how do we make them real for many kinds of people? So
Absolutely.
thank you for the reflections. It helps us to hear the kinds of things where compassion is relevant in your work, to think of examples, because we have studied compassion in a lot of different types of contexts, and we can address different kinds of suffering. And I keep using the word suffering. I'm going to use the word pain in this diagram, but I want to tell you why. So when psychologists define compassion, they usually define it in the way that I have it written here, that it's sensitivity to pain or suffering of another person or other people, coupled with a deep desire to alleviate that suffering. So psychologists often think of compassion as a form of emotion, or as this desire for action, this sort of motivation for action. And in organizational studies and as organizational scholars, we've tried to define compassion a little bit differently than that, because like Jane said, we wanted to see how it was moving across and woven into the structure of organizations. So we've developed a way of talking about compassion as a 4-part human experience, not just we, many scholars in this field, where we're always working in relationship to pain or suffering of some sort. And that's what differentiates compassion from neighboring concepts like kindness, for instance, that as a close cousin, kindness is wonderful to have in our society, but kindness doesn't always come forth in the presence of suffering. It can come forth in other spaces as well. So when we're in the presence of pain and suffering, I mentioned before that one of the first things that has to happen is that we have to give attention to that suffering and notice the pain that's there. This is really crucial, because when we don't want to notice or pay attention, the rest of the whole process can't really unfold. And the next part in the 4-part process of noticing, we call interpreting, right? It's how we make sense of what's going on, how we interpret the ambiguous cues or signals, or read what's happening with other people, and come to understand it in a way that helps it make sense to us, and also that activates our sense of concern for other people's well-being and our empathy for others or for our own distress. And a particular kind of empathy is really important here. Scholars call it empathic concern. It's the kind of empathy that says, I can be concerned for Kim's not feeling well after her flu shot, even if, as is common in our society today, I don't believe in flu shots, right? Like we might have some very fundamental difference, and I can still feel concerned for Kim's well-being. That's what we mean by empathic concern. And that's really important in work organizations as a form of empathy that can travel across all kinds of differences and differences in status, differences in roles, etc. And then finally, the fourth part, noticing, interpreting, feeling empathic concern, finding a way to take action from small to big and coordinated. We have to take action to alleviate suffering in order to see it manifest in organizational contexts. And so when we refer to the word compassion, we're talking about this whole dynamic unfolding four-part human process that occurs in relation to pain.
So Monica, can I just build on some things in the chat?
Yeah.
So Salar says, talks about, I think it triggered for you, Salar, the idea of having compassion with clients who are in need for services and products. And I just think about like how many customer service people are trained for compassion, in their interaction, or is it, against the clock ticking about how many calls you have to have per period of time, it's just to get the transaction executed. So I think that's actually a beautiful example of a particular job where you could tweak it towards compassion. But also it makes me think about us as educators. You're a professor too, like, have we ever been called to show compassion towards our students who are in need of services, teaching and education from us? I don't know about you, but at U of M, it was never part of my job description to be compassionate. It was implicit in certain places, but it was never a part of my job description or job expectation. So I think it gets us curious about how can we define roles in ways that actually includes compassion. And that's partly answering Kim's question, what are some small manageable ways that one can show compassion? Well, one is to enact our roles and jobs as if this is part of what we're supposed to be doing. And it means kind of being explicit about that. So, in our first class with students, when we're talking about rules for engagement, maybe we say something like, I want to be a professor where it's safe for you to tell me, if you can't show up at class. And not, I don't know about you, but again, I was trained to have doubts about what students' excuses really were. They were just trying to get out of work. Out of the work of the class when, especially during COVID, so many were so sick and now they're scared and anxious. So anyway, so we can play a lot with our role, the roles that we take on, and how we enact our role as parents, as educators, as workers. But also we can, if we're in charge of other people, help think about how we could define their roles in ways that include compassion as a part of it.
Yes, that is exactly true. And actually, I was thinking about companies that have clients with special needs, let's say healthcare companies and so on, and compassion in that way. But your example actually makes very much sense in our role. And personally, I have seen a few examples that I was reminded by. Sometimes the students stop showing up. And in the busy time of the semester, it may be very easy to forget that someone is not showing up. But a few times I have reached out And once there was a student who replied that I have experienced mental illness, and thank you very much for reaching out. No one reached out to me, and that the student was encouraged to come back and finish the class.
Yeah.
What a beautiful story. Yeah. It makes a difference. And that's what they're going to remember. Our research shows that's what they will remember about Eastern, was the fact that a
Right.
faculty member reached out when I was hurting.
Yeah.
It's
And it's such a good transition to noticing, Jane, because we want to talk about noticing pain or suffering as an especially important space to think about how we do our roles and how we build more compassion into our organizations. And Salar said, you know, when the semester is busy and I'm trying to pay attention to a lot of things, it's easy to lose track of who's not showing up. But if we build into our teaching practice and our routines of attendance and so on, not just who's not there for grading purposes,
Right.
but are there students that disappeared who might be suffering, and could I account for them by reaching out, which is allowing your noticing of an ambiguous cue, right, to lead to an action of inquiry that then launches the compassion process. So the example is so helpful. And we were going to talk a bit more as we talk about ways to notice and ways to craft more compassion, about some of the research that shows what happens when we experience compassion too. And I had forgotten the order here, so I thought we were going right into noticing next, but it's good to share that there's a lot of research on compassion and work now, more all the time. And some of the research focuses on what happens for those who are suffering and who do find compassion for their suffering. And as you might expect, data shows less anxiety, and can we erase those?
Mhm.
It's okay. I think you just keep going.
All right.
Yes.
I was thinking I might be able to just quickly erase, but
Mhm.
so I think it makes sense to us that people who are suffering get relief when they encounter compassion. Some of the other things that people study about compassion show something that you might expect a little less, which is that people who act with compassion at work also feel better in particular kinds of ways. They tend to get greater satisfaction from work or experience greater satisfaction with their life outside of work as well. Some findings show that people who can act with compassion at work feel strengthened in the identity of who they can be at work, and they really like being able to show up as a compassionate person in a work environment. And commitment to the organization is strengthened, which builds one kind of key part of the business case, that when organizations are judged as more compassionate by the people in them, they tend to want to stay more. And then finally, one of my favorite groups of findings is that when we see compassion happening around us in work organizations, when we hear the stories of compassion, even if we weren't acting or we aren't part of the story, it has an effect on us to be in the presence of compassion. We can take pride in the work that we do. We can be more motivated to respond when we encounter suffering around us. And it decreases our sense of cynicism, which right now is really important as people get fearful, like we've talked about here, they tend to be more mistrusting or tend to think that other people are greedy or selfish or out to get them. And we can decrease some of that cynicism with a greater emphasis on compassion at work. All right, so I'll just quickly mention this. I forgot this was here. Jane, I was taking us into talking about noticing, but we'll just quickly point to there are benefits to compassion at work that are important for organizations that want to do innovation. Compassion is related to learning processes. We've already talked about psychological safety, knowledge sharing, and idea sharing hinges on psychological safety. I mentioned commitment. So you'd expect that more compassion tends to decrease turnover in organizations. And there's a strong relationship between feeling that you're compassionate your organization is compassionate and having more engagement in the organization. Service quality and care quality are related to compassion because, as Salar already mentioned, handling service needs is a form of usually handling something difficult or painful. And compassion can also relate to adaptability and recovering from challenges of various kinds. So let's move ahead to talk about noticing, because we had such a great example of why noticing matters to set off the whole process. And one
So Kim can't wait. So Kim asked the question, what was one of the unexpected takeaways from our research? And I think we're hovering on noticing because that was an unexpected takeaway. We were
Okay.
focused mostly on action, like what's
Yep.
compassionate, what's not. We weren't as aware of all the breakdowns in noticing and how organizations snuff out the signals or create
Yep.
disincentives for the signals of pain.
Mm,
yeah.
So I think we've written a lot about noticing. So that was a real like aha for us. In retrospect, it seems obvious, but it was not when we
Right.
began.
yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. And it isn't always obvious that if you're looking for compassionate action, you would need to, change attention. So what we can do to notice more is really to also start noticing the quality of our own attention. And in work organizations, this is an especially important point, that our attention is fractured in all kinds of ways. And the age we live in, lots of technologies and lots of social factors aim to fracture our attention, right? So we have so much information. We have social media, we have algorithms that vie for our attention and so on. When we can't ourselves slow down and tune into our own quality of what we're attending to, we lose the ability to pick up on the small cues or the things that we need to notice to know that other people are suffering. So this is one very practical and pragmatic way that we can attend to ourselves and what's going on in our own attentional capacity. And we can also help others do it and guide others do it and talk about how we're paying attention to things.
Monica, sorry, here we are. This is a duetting move. Let me give an example. We were on a Zoom call with a bunch of people. There was a panel presenting, and someone on the panel, as sort of a throwaway, but it was almost like it just leaked out, mentioned her father had gone into the hospital that day. And it was just, again, we were conducting work as regular. And another member of the panel said, okay, I heard Joe mention this. Let's pause for a minute. And he said, and he took us through this practice where he said, imagine there's a pearl between our hands. So he got everybody on the Zoom call to imagine there was a pearl in between their hands, and that you are now endowing that pearl with care. And now send it out to Joe. And again, it took 2 minutes, but it was this beautiful model of, when you're on Zoom calls and tension is fractured, and oftentimes people are, multitasking and all that kind of thing, how the person in the position, sort of noticed, stopped, and helped everybody notice. So I love that example.
Thank you, Jane.
That's
Such
great,
a good
yeah.
example. And so let's talk about a few other kinds of, what do we do to notice more? How can we practice changing our attention so that we notice more? Well, single tasking instead of multitasking. Most people in work organizations, when I talk about this, feel like it's impossible, but it's not impossible, right? It's important. And there's a wonderful new book called Attention Span by a researcher from the University of California, Irvine, Gloria Mark, who shows that when you just have your email on in addition to other work you're doing, it puts your heart in a state of high alert. Like that's the state that they measured just before a heart attack, right? So we can pay attention to how we're doing small things that structure our attention to being more fractured. It's also important interpersonally. If we can give more full attention interpersonally, we can catch things that go by quickly and pause, like Jane's story illustrated, or actively activate compassion around us, or inquire in a different kind of way. And it often, suffering shows up in cues like people are a bit irritable, or they're more impatient than they usually are, or maybe there's an outburst that is unexpected. Those are often indicators of suffering if we pause and explore what's going on behind them. But we have to be paying enough attention and tune in enough to do that, rather than simply express irritation back or blame the person for the outburst, right? So it's not automatic that we would see the suffering unless we give it more attention. And then we can use our bodies as great spaces, registers of what's happening. So you can tune into what you're feeling. And if you're feeling something uncomfortable, you might want to look around and see what is this telling me about what's going on around me. Breathing is a really important tool for slowing ourselves down, calming ourselves down, restoring some fullness to our attention, and getting us ready to be more compassionate with others.
Can I just mention another thought that fits this, is that we often learn to disconnect from our bodies, and we have intuitions, about things like someone seems off, etc. But, neuroscience is helping us see how hardwired our brains are with each other, especially around pain, so that we can pick up other people's pain. But if we're in organizations where it's like, oh, no, that's nosy. I mean, there's a lot of stories you can tell yourself that shut down that bodily awareness that somebody else is not doing well. And so part of it is learning to sense that and be with that, and make you curious about what might be happening, that your body is picking up those cues. Yeah. Again, something that faculty could be trained on, actually,
Right.
given the number of people that we run into. Go ahead, Monica, sorry.
No, that Kim was asking in the chat what research we have on the horizon related to these ideas about noticing, and then allowing our noticing to help us interpret people differently, feel more empathy, and act with more compassion. And I wanted to mention that we've been learning I've been learning, I'm really curious to do some research on a practice that's called council, COUNCIL. Some of you may know it. It's a practice of it at its very basic form. It's a practice of people sitting in a circle with the intention of sharing stories with one another and using a talking object to share the floor so that everyone has a chance to have a voice in the circle. And in that sense, it's a very ancient practice of humans, gathering around a fire and sharing stories. It's a sort of essential part of human history. But what we've been watching is how this practice is being adapted and used in education organizations. We're entering into a study with Snap Inc., the parent company of Snapchat, where they, as a technology organization, use this routine all the time to try to build a higher quality culture to help people know each other better and be more aware of each other, build more inclusion and foster a sense of belonging. And also in groups that are using this with the justice system to try to restore health and community to people who do policing work, and to bring formerly incarcerated people together with people who do policing work to restore forms of social trust. So I think we're going to learn a lot by researching a routine and how that routine can travel to different organizational contexts in order to help people use stories and sharing to notice more about one another and to use what we learn in that circle to activate compassion in all kinds of ways that travel beyond the circle.
Solara, I just wanted to respond to your question about, have you seen research that compassion creates sense of elevation? And there are, when Monica and I started, there were only very few people doing compassion work in organizations. Now the Compassion Lab has over 50 researchers. And if you were interested in a particular question, we could pose it to the Compassion Lab to find out who is doing work on this. I mean, I'm retired. I'm not doing any more work of that kind, but there are a lot of young researchers who are doing work. And certainly your question, I would say, I think there's evidence there. I just can't cite the studies, but I know people who could. So if you wanted to follow that up, we're happy to connect you to that email list.
Absolutely. So if we just move ahead as we come to the end of our time together, we wanted to touch on thinking about compassion when we ourselves are scared, or we ourselves are feeling depleted or overloaded, because we know faculty lives are hard lives, and we've already talked about the other kinds of social factors that are present with us. And so we want to turn our attention for a few minutes as we talk about this to the idea of interpreting and of kind of making sense and telling ourselves and other people stories about what's happening with suffering in ways that might help us be more effective, more competent compassion activators and compassion givers. So this idea at its heart, we talk about as generous interpretations, that when we can fall back on the idea that people are essentially good, that people are generally capable, and that people are inherently worthy of compassion and care and dignity, then we can usually, from that kind of story, move quickly into empathic concern and compassionate action. And when we feel depleted, when we're scared, when our systems of defense are getting raised, it's easy for us to lose hold of this kind of interpretation. When we get in organizations, when we get overwhelmed, or someone who's suffering isn't pulling their weight, or they're missing deadlines or making mistakes, it becomes really easy when we're overwhelmed to get really angry with them for missing deadlines or making mistakes, instead of tuning into, that's not really like them. I bet they don't want to be missing this deadline or making this mistake. Let me figure out what's going on here. Let's see if we can solve the deadline issue, but also take care of the person, right? And that's what a generous interpretation sounds like in a work context that unfolds like that. And you could do it with students too, around assignments. This is one place where there's a lot of suffering that shows up around students and assignments, right?
Mhm.
So when we get depleted or when we get scared, as I mentioned, it just becomes harder for us to interpret generously and to see people this way. And all kinds of other things get in our way too. When we see people as other for some reason or another, when we're in the grip of a stereotype or a form of unconscious bias, we can stop seeing people as good and capable and worthy. And so we have to have ways to recognize when we're doing that and interrupt the cycle. So whether it's because we're busy, we're overloaded, or some stereotype has been activated, or we got scared, or whatever happened, we have to recognize, I can no longer see the good in that other person in front of me. I can no longer see them as worthy of care or dignity or compassion. And so I need to shift my state somehow to tell a different story, right? And we have to do this as collectives too. I'm saying it as an individual, but we help the people around us interpret what's happening with a person. We participate in groups that do evaluations of other people, right? And how we talk about people in those groups really matters. And so I often use and teach this 3 breaths pattern that has been researched by a researcher named Kelly McGonigal at Stanford University. And her research focuses on taking 3 deep breaths, where as you breathe in, on the first breath, you just try to expand your heart, and then let your expanded heart out. On your next breath, you try to breathe in compassion for whatever's happening, for yourself or other people feeling in distress. And then in your expanded heart, let that compassion go. And the third breath, breathe in compassion for you doing this work. And in your expanded heart, let the compassion go with your out breath. And if you can call on the breath and the intentional breathing of compassion, the research demonstrates that we can individually change our state within the space of 3 breaths. And it restores our capacity to do the work of social justice and helping other people make different interpretations, or it restores the work of creating a more empathetic story and caring about the well-being of others around us. So we get back to a state where we can be effective agents of compassion.
That is so wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes, so this is I feel like we've just given you a little taste of, there's so much we can do. We just need to share with each other.
Yeah.
And I just have to say, for those of you who are here, or those of my, what a blessing it has been to be involved in this research. I feel like I'm a better human from having witnessed these stories and trying to make sense of them and stuff. And just, we want to invite people who are interested. There's just so much going on around the world now. There's a global compassion movement. There's compassionate cities. There are all these social movements trying to unleash compassion in our society. So it's a real beacon of hope, I feel. So I hope we've generated.
I highly
It's
recommend the
something
book, Awakening Compassion in the Workplace.
Yeah, I have the book right here.
Yeah,
Yep. We
it's
tried to
such a
give
great
you
book.
little places to start.
Yeah,
So
Thank you for having us,
finding
Kim.
Kim.
thank you so much.
Thank you very much.